Thank you very much. And our next item is topical questions. The first question from James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the Auditor-General's comments that the Scottish Prison Service faces a combination of severe pressures on many fronts, and this poses a threat to operational safety, effectiveness and financial sustainability.
Cabinet Secretary Hamza Youssef.
I take very seriously the pressures facing Scotland's prisons, in particular the rising prison population. I've been working closely with the Prison Service to ensure robust measures are in place to ensure the safety of staff and, of course, those in our care. As successive independent inspections have highlighted, we must never take for granted the good order that is maintained in our prisons. The most recent annual report by Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons for Scotland notes that she is reassured that despite a rising prison population, staff and prisoners reported feeling safe. As confirmed in the Auditor-General's report, we've also confirmed the allocation of additional revenue funding to the SPS in the current year to help meet the costs of the increasing prison population and indeed the other pressures highlighted. Additional capital funding has also been committed towards the prison estate, including for the new female estate and the development of a replacement for HMP Barlinnie. I will reflect on all of the issues raised in the Auditor-General's report in conjunction with SPS and address these. It will also involve us all looking at the factors that drive Scotland's high rate of imprisonment, the highest in Western Europe. That is why it's important that we work together in this Parliament to back progressive justice reforms.
James Kelly.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. The Auditor-General's report is indeed stark, highlighting issues with overcrowding in prisons, budget shortfalls, and also the availability of fit and well prison officers. That's underlined by a 12.5% reduction in the operating budget from 2014-15 to 18-19, 60% increase in prison officers on sickness absence, and it seems to me that the Government are short on answers. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what specific actions the Government will take to address the budget shortfall and also the increase in numbers of prison officers on sickness absence?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank James Kelly for the question. Let me give him an absolute reassurance that the Government takes extremely seriously the Auditor-General's concerns and concerns generally that have been raised around the prison population and the prison estate. And at the root of the vast majority, if not all, of the concerns raised by the Auditor-General is the fact that we have far too high a prison population. That adds to the financial pressure, adds to the pressure on the prison estate, adds to the pressure on staff, that adds to the pressure right across the prison estate. So we have to reflect carefully on the root cause, and if we address that root cause of a high imprisonment rate, then we can hopefully address each of these issues. In terms of the specific questions he asks, I mentioned in my first answer that we have given additional revenue and capital allocations to SPS. In terms of the following financial year, of course, we'll look carefully at what the Auditor-General has said. I'll have those conversations with the Finance Secretary for the future spending review. And the second question that he asks around staff sicknesses, the recent pay award agreed with the Prisoner Officers Association, one of the key issues as part of that pay deal was to tackle the issue around staff sicknesses and absences. But clearly, if we can reduce the prison population, then of course that will make a big difference in the pressure that prison officers are facing.
James Kelly.
In reducing the prison population, one of the options available to the Government is the use of the through care service. Unfortunately, that was suspended in July, and we heard this morning at the Justice Committee the benefits of that service from the likes of SACRO and the WISE Group. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary when the through care service is going to be re-established with the reintroduction of the 42 officers to support that service?
Cabinet Secretary.
And again, thanks James Kelly for that question. I think it's a really important question that he asks. I can confirm to Parliament that the third sector is meeting with SPS tomorrow. They are at advanced negotiations and stages in terms of the third sector potentially stepping into that space while the temporary suspension of through care support is taking place. And they should be able to cover that through care support service, which is a very positive outcome. Now that's hopefully a temporary measure because the third sector, the through care support officers are previously doing that job hopefully it can be relieved of the duties they're doing if we reduce the prison population and able to do that job. I can hear Joanne Lamont chuntering from the sidelines. Yes, that's a serious suggestion that the third sector is able to come in and provide that. So I think that's a good outcome. I think that's a preferred outcome for all of us in relation to those that want to see through care support re-established in our prisons. And the fact that the third sector are able to hopefully step into that space, I think is a very welcome development indeed. The I's have to be dotted and the T's have to be crossed on this, but of course once I have an absolute confirmation that the third sector will be able to provide that through care support, I'll make sure that James Kelly and indeed anybody else chuntering from the sidelines or anybody that has an interest in this more seriously, will make sure they're kept updated.
Thank you. I've got a potential 5 members wish to ask a supplementary. I don't think I'll get through them all, but I would encourage succinctness as usual. Liam Kerr to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This report confirms that assaults in prisons have rocketed, although they've been rising for some time. So has the government initiated a review into the precise causes and triggers of that violence in order to find solutions to better protect prisoners and officers?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, again, one of the reasons that we know for assaults is the increase in psychoactive substances in our prisons, something that Liam Kerr's written to me about previously. There are a number of pieces of equipment that are being trialled and piloted in our prison estate to help to identify what is really a very, very difficult substance to detect for a whole variety of reasons. So I think that is absolutely part of the solution. But if I may go back to my previous answer, the root cause of this, if we can reduce the number of people in our prisons, then hopefully that will reduce, of course, the pressure that is on prison officers, staff, but also, it also hopefully would have some element of an effect of reduction of violence in our prisons as well, because we know a number of prisoners are now having to, for example, share cells where previously they weren't. They have less recreation time. Obviously, all these things add to the stresses and strains within a prison estate. So there are a number of factors, and of course, if Liam Kerr wants more detail, I'm more than happy to speak to him after these questions.
Rona Mackay to be followed by John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what impact the presumption of short sentences will have on female prisoners in particular, many of whom are serving sentences of less than 1 year?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, it's an important point. There are a number of things that we can do and have just recently done that will help to reduce the prison population. Presumption against short sentences is one of those things. Tackling the remand population is something that we will look to do. Potentially revise guidance around home detention curfew on the back of inspectorate reports may be another. The presumption against short sentences will have an impact. It will help to reduce some of the churn that we see coming in and out of our prisons. And to answer Rona Mackay's direct question, it will have a disproportionately positive effect on the female custodial estate. Would be around about 90% of those within custody are females that are in custody are in for less than 12 months.
John Finney to be followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, you'll know that this report builds on one of the HM Inspector of Prisons' annual report, where both talk about the significant additional costs incurred by acquiring additional places from private prisons. And indeed, the report talks about the inevitable impact adversely on other planned investments. What are you going to do to stop the situation whereby private companies are profiting at the expense of the inefficiencies in the wider prison estate?
Cabinet Secretary.
We have no plans to build more private prison estates, if that is the suggestion. Of course, I would say to John Finney, I know he understands this, that any of the measures that have been taken, whether it's purchasing private spaces at quite a cost, or indeed the withdrawal of through care support officers, to hopefully we have a mitigation to that. These are not decisions that are taken lightly by the prison service. They do that to maintain the good order within our prisons. That is why the inspectorate reports, successive inspectorate reports, have mentioned that there is good order within our prisons. So we will look to any solution that can help to ease the current tensions that we have within our prison estate and still maintain public safety. If that means having to use the private spaces available, then so be it. But these are not decisions that are taken at all lightly.
Daniel Johnson.
The report points to the fact that the use of supervised bail has fallen by almost a third since 2005-06. Given that that's 20% of the prison population and it's used twice the rate that it is in England and Wales, what steps and investments will the Cabinet Secretary make to avoid the use of remand as the default option for people awaiting trial?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Daniel Johnson for an incredibly important question. So there's a few things that we can do. So we'll increase our additional investment, or we'll continue to increase our investment in terms of alternatives to custody, and that includes bail and remand. What I would say is that it's very important that we see this issue in the round. I had recently very positive conversations with, for example, some sheriff principals who, of course, their decisions whether or not to grant bail is hugely important. So I'm very keen that the Justice Board and our Justice Leaders Networks come together to look at this in a holistic way. What I will say to him is also recently passed legislation hopefully allows us to explore other technologies such as GPS technology. So there's a whole range and suite of measures that we can help to bring forward. It's going to involve more than just the government in this conversation, but what I can give him an absolute determination is I agree with his assessment that our population on remand is far too high, particularly in comparison to England and Wales, and therefore this government definitely sees tackling remand, the numbers on remand, as part of the solution to reduce our prison population.
Neil Findlay.
I've seen minutes from a health and safety meeting at one of Scotland's prisons where the categorisation of new psychoactive substances will stop and be recategorised as unknown substances. Might this be the reason why there's a 1% fall in drugs misuse reported in the Audit Scotland report at a time of a staffing crisis and overcrowding? And will the Cabinet Secretary investigate this change in categorisation, because the fear from staff is that this is manipulating the figures?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'll have a look at the issue that Neil Findlay raises. Absolutely, we'll have a look at that and investigate the reasons for any recategorisation. If I can give an absolute assurance to Neil Findlay, in all the meetings that I've had with the Scottish Prison Service, with the Prison Officers Association, with the Prison Governors Association, and many other trade unions involved within the prisons, nobody has once attempted, including the prison service themselves, nobody once has attempted to downplay the damage that psychoactive substances are having and doing in our prisons, not least to our prisoners, but also, of course, to the staff very much as well. So if he wants an assurance that, that this is not being downplayed, then I can give him an absolute assurance it's not being downplayed. The reasons for recategorisation, I will investigate as he's asked me to do so.
Thank you. Question number 2, Liam MacArthur.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government how it will address the reported backlog of unresolved criminal cases.
Solicitor General Alison de Rollo.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As at today, the number of criminal cases in which no initial decision has been made is 17,342. This represents somewhere between 4 and 5 weeks of work in hand. Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service has a target of taking initial decisions in 75% of cases within 4 weeks. The current work in hand is consistent with meeting that target by this year end. Following the allocation of additional resources, staffing in the unit responsible for this work is higher than ever before, with a view to reducing the amount of work in hand at any given time.
Liam MacArthur.
Can I thank the Solicitor General for that response? So to many 17,000 cases sitting waiting for a decision to be made will seem very much on the high side. The numbers reported to include allegations of the most serious crimes, including rape and attempted murder. While those cases are locked in a holding pattern, victims waiting for a decision can often feel further traumatised. One is reported saying earlier this week, I felt like I was the accused, it was an arduous experience and I would never report a crime again. So in light of these figures and those comments, does the Solicitor General believe the Crown Office has the resources it needs to carry out the work it is charged with undertaking?
Solicitor General.
COPFS is absolutely committed to reducing the time it takes for cases to progress through the criminal justice system, for the reasons that Liam Kerr has just explained. As a result of an additional £5 million of funding allocated to COPFS by the Scottish Government, Scotland's Prosecution Service is on track to have its highest ever number of staff. Given the specialist nature of the work that we do, the decisions to prosecute, the decisions to assess whether there is sufficient evidence to bring charges, the decision whether further inquiries are needed of specialist reporting agencies in an increasingly complex and specialist caseload, it's going to take some time for the full benefits of the increased resource to feed through. However, I can say that incremental improvements can be expected in the interim, and crucially, COPFS keeps its processes, including that critical initial decision process, under review. It is monitored weekly and will respond to its changing caseload and progress the whole of its work as effectively as possible.
Liam McCarthy.
Again, can I thank the Solicitor General for that response, although the backlog in unresolved criminal cases has echoes of delays in the fatal accident inquiries highlighted by my party and others over recent months. Following earlier research by Scottish Liberal Democrats, the Inspectorate of Prosecutions has concluded that FAIs are characterised by, quote, lengthy intervals of unexplained delays and, quote, periods of inactivity which have the potential to devalue the purpose of the FAI. Overstretched workloads and inefficient collaboration with other agencies were cited by the Inspectorate. Again, does the Solicitor General not accept that this is further evidence that the Crown Office does not have the resources it needs, and consequently that access to justice is not available to everyone in Scotland who needs it?
Solicitor General.
Well, COPFS has identified needs for resources to address its ever-changing caseload. And as Liam Kerr will be aware, although the absolute... Liam McCarthy will be aware, although the absolute raw number of reports received has been on the decline in recent years, there has been a significant increase in the number of more serious and complex cases, including deaths investigations. So, in response to that changing caseload, COPFS is also committed to improving its service performance. And in particular, I have to say, in relation to deaths investigations, where it is accepted that some cases, although the vast majority, are dealt with and concluded within targets and within reasonable expectations, some very few cases have taken far too long. So in securing the additional resources, the Lord Advocate has made quite plain, and COPFS is implementing an improvement plan which will aim to reduce the journey time of all High Court cases, and particularly cases involving children and young people, to front-load work on these large and complex cases that we're seeing coming through. More than ever, serious organised crime cases are being successfully detected by the police, reported to us, and prosecuted successfully. So those additional resources are going to be committed to meeting the expectations set out in the High Court practice note on the management of lengthy and complex cases issued by the High Court. But also, and critically to answer the question, to implement a programme of improvement work with a view to reducing the duration of some of these more complex death investigations. And I must stress, and I'm sure the member understands, that in those few cases it can call for complex factual and legal issues to be investigated before it gets to an FAI. It calls for expert evidence, which in our experience can be commissioned from a wide variety of jurisdictions, not just here in Scotland. So the reduction of the journey time in death investigations to FAI is absolutely at the heart of the overall improvement programme and what these additional resources are being committed to.
Gordon Lyndhurst.
Cases are often delayed, returned to police because of errors or missing evidence. Will the Crown Office now start to record these so that data on these and the specific breakdowns can be made available?
Solicitor General.
Cases that are returned to the police can be for a wide variety of complex reasons, and I'm not sure it's all that easy or straightforward or a good use of time to categorise them by errors or misinformation. It's in the nature of our unique investigation and prosecution of crime system in Scotland that the prosecutor gives direction to the police. And I say again, we all in the criminal justice fraternity are facing an increasingly changing, complex caseload with serious and organised crime, serious sexual offending and homicide. So our priority is to work with the police, not just in the submission of, and the resending of individual reports, but to work with Police Scotland closely to drive up standards, to express our expectations, to discuss the standards of sufficiency of evidence, and so by that embrace a sort of continual improvement programme.
Thank you. Question number 3, Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government for its response to the Universities UK survey released on Monday, which claims Scottish universities will lose staff and students in the event of a no-deal Brexit.
Minister Richard Lockhead.
This survey further highlights that no deal is utterly unacceptable. Half of the Scottish respondents reported difficulties in retaining or recruiting EU staff, and a third say that demand for EU students has fluctuated. And we know over a quarter of Scottish university research staff are EU citizens, and Scotland has the highest proportion of EU university enrolments in the whole of the UK. So the reality is the UK is not and cannot be ready for a no-deal EU exit on October the 31st, and the UK Government must take that off the table. Our commitment to supporting eligible EU students commencing courses in the academic year 2020-21 is a clear example of our determination to mitigate the effects of the UK Government's deeply damaging position and keep Scotland an open and welcoming nation.
Gillian Martin.
I thank the Minister for that answer. He'll no doubt join me in expressing his relief. After 7 years of campaigning by my party, the UK Government has last week performed a much-needed U-turn on their decision on the removal of the post-study work visa. But I'd also like to ask if his office have done an assessment on the impacts of the last 3 years of pre-Brexit chaos and a Tory government that wants to end freedom of movement at all costs, and what that already has had, and what effect that already has had on the sector in terms of funding, recruitment and retention of staff and students.
Lockhead.
Firstly, can I welcome the return of the post-study work visa that was announced by the UK Government in the last few days, and pay tribute to the campaigning by the higher education sector in Scotland, our institutions and student organisations, and of course colleagues within the Scottish Government who've worked in partnership with them ever since the original visa was scrapped, and we do welcome the fact that it now has been replaced. In terms of the impact of Brexit on our higher education sector, as asked by Gillian Martin, the survey's findings, which is the subject of this question, correspond with the understanding of the Scottish Government as well. 50% of respondents in this survey we're discussing today said they had already lost existing or potential staff to overseas universities that they could directly attribute to the prospect of a no-deal Brexit. 40% of respondents said they experienced fluctuations in collaboration amongst EU partners. And 1 in 3 said they'd already experienced fluctuations in demand from EU students. So that chimes very much with the evidence we've been receiving as a government in terms of the damage to research projects in the higher education sector because of Brexit and the threat of Brexit, in terms of key staff who are now looking to return to their home countries in the case of EU nationals. I've had many examples from many universities of that happening as well. So any kind of Brexit is deeply damaging to Scottish further and higher education and science, and no deal Brexit would be an absolute body blow to the sector.
Martin.
Thanks for that answer. Scottish universities have done a tremendous job in working with their staff and students from other EU countries to prepare for Brexit insofar that they can. But with 1 in 5 academics in Scottish universities originating from other EU countries, what can the Scottish Government do to ensure that they continue to want to work here? And does he agree with me that freedom of movement has to be put back on the table by Boris Johnson as he speaks to his counterparts in the rest of the EU?
Minister.
It's absolutely the case that the removal of freedom of movement will make life very difficult for our universities to compete with the rest of Europe in a range of ways. And clearly I don't have time to go into all of them just now, but I have referred to some of those impacts in my previous answer, and I'd absolutely support any calls for the UK Government to reinstate a commitment to freedom of movement and a much better deal if Brexit does happen, but of course the best outcome would be no Brexit happening whatsoever, and then the continuity of freedom of movement for both students and staff in Europe to protect our universities. In terms of what the Scottish Government is doing, we have reached out to both our institutions and other European governments to spread the message and convey the message that Scotland will remain a welcoming country. We're an outward-looking internationalist country. That message has been warmly received by institutions across Europe and European governments. And of course, even today, during a visit to Perth College UHI, I was speaking to overseas students who were studying languages there, and they said they've very much received that message and feel very comfortable living and studying in Scotland, and of course they're wanting our ongoing support to make sure that can continue to be the case.
We're over time, but a brief other question from Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given that the sector highlight uncertainty, will the SNP commit to supporting a future Brexit deal And does the Minister regret the fact that his MPs at Westminster voted against the withdrawal agreement when it could have secured certainty back in March?
Minister.
I really urge Oliver Mundell and his Conservative colleagues to get their heads out of the sand and recognise the damage that is already being caused to our Scottish further and higher education and science sectors, and Brexit hasn't even happened yet. And therefore, if Oliver Mundell cared about the future of our students, our knowledge economy, our universities and colleges, he would stop campaigning for a Brexit and he would start campaigning against any kind of Brexit and support the best outcome for the viability of Scottish further and higher education.
Thank you very much. And that concludes topical.